Well, good afternoon, everyone. And for once, we'll start on time. Welcome to the, as I like to start calling it now, the kebab and curry seminar. I'm glad we're here and enjoying the food. I basically live for this now. I'll try the eggplant this month. All right. This is the last one that we're having in the Rhodes Centre series for this semester, and I'm delighted to end with Zsófia Barta. She is a professor at the University of Albany at SUNY, and has a background which crosses my own in many ways. I taught at Johns Hopkins for a number of years, and Zsófia was originally a master's student at both SAIS in DC and at Bologna. And at Bologna, I have a very good friend who she worked with and was on her dissertation, a guy called Eric Jones, who basically I like to describe as if someone needs to know where the bodies are buried and the plumbing is rigged in Europe, that's the guy you ask. He knows a lot of good stuff. He then went to the LSE, another institution I know well, and worked with Waltraud Schelke on her PhD, which has become this great book, In the Red, The Politics of Debt Accumulation in Developed Countries. And without further ado, I shall pass it over to Zsófia. Welcome to Brown.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here and present my book about the politics of public debt accumulation in developed countries. And so the puzzle that I investigate in this book So the puzzle that I investigate in this book is why some prosperous developed countries like Belgium, Italy, Greece, or Canada, or even Japan, borrowed consistently for many, many decades, 40 or 50 years, and accumulated significant amounts of debt that was really unprecedented in peacetime, and put these countries in rather precarious positions. Well, we know that debt has been growing almost everywhere in the developed world in the past decades, but there is a significant variation in the debt trajectories of countries. Some borrowed persistently, some borrowed less persistently. My focus is really on countries that have shown the worst outcomes in terms of debt. But before I jump into discussing my explanation for what happened to these very highly indebted countries, I think I need to digress shortly and reflect on the question whether debt is really such a big problem. After all, I was invited by a scholar who very convincingly argued that borrowing and debt is sometimes demonized by governments for political reasons and in order to manipulate electorates to concede to policies that they don't want to otherwise take. And I completely agree with that proposition. I agree with Mark, who took up the fight against the Bocconi boys and all the authoritarians who gave us the David Camerons and the George Osbornes of this world. And I agree that borrowing is sometimes necessary and definitely often the lesser evil. Yet I also think that there is levels of debt that we should worry about, because beyond a certain level, that creates a vulnerability to footloose investors and panicky markets that could very quickly pull the rug from under the feet of countries. Also, it exposes countries to the influence of outside actors like the IMF or credit rating agencies who very much like to dictate policy. On the other hand, that is also a constraint. Governments that are very heavily indebted have a harder time managing their economy, responding to demands or new needs in their societies. And that, therefore, is politically also inconvenient. So even if you don't think of that as a policy problem, you should think about it as a political problem, because governments don't like to have their hands tied. They like to have the fiscal room to move. And indeed, even if you look at the worst indebted countries like Greece or Japan or Italy, what you find is as soon as that started to increase in all of these countries, governments started to do something against it. And the big puzzle that I'm looking at is why, if that is politically inconvenient and policymakers try to rein it in, how come the problem lasts for 40 or 50 years with fairly deleterious results? And so I definitely focus on those countries that have gone into this red zone, hence the title of the book, In the Red. And I'm obviously not the first person to be interested in the issue of that. However, I think that most people who have looked into this question have asked the wrong question. Because if you really think about it, that is a curious, dynamic policy problem. Because what is at the core of the debt problem is that once there is a fiscal imbalance, however it was originally created, that fiscal imbalance persists until you actively do something against it. And not only does it persist, but because each year more and more is added to, larger and larger pieces are added to the debt stock, therefore you pay higher and higher interest, so it's kind of a self-reinforcing, self-perpetuating problem. And therefore, it's not really useful to ask why countries originally borrow. There are many branches of the literature. The public choice school has argued that governments borrow opportunistically to increase their political chances. Others, like Mark Halleberg, talked a lot about the importance of institutions for what he calls fiscal indiscipline. You can talk about how Keynesians use that in order to stimulate the economy, but those are not really the questions I wanted to ask, because in the countries that I'm looking at, the question is not why countries originally borrowed. All of those explanations fit one or two or one or more of those countries. The real question is why they didn't stop borrowing once that has gotten to a level that started to create vulnerabilities and constraints. Others have pointed out that developed countries all suffer from the same kind of budgetary pressures as growth slowed in many of these countries. Unemployment got permanently higher. They faced aging populations. The likes of Streeck would argue that this is only natural that the developed countries got so indebted. But then they kind of underplayed the importance of countries that did not get so indebted. And so the question is, which countries can deal with such pressures and which countries are permanently affected by that? So you could approach this question from the angle of adjustment. So once all of these different factors put pressure on developed countries, which countries can adjust and which can't? And there's a lot of great literature out there about adjustment, but it focuses really on the conditions under which adjustment can happen. And so they treat adjustment as something that either exists or doesn't exist. But what we very often see in the case of these countries is sometimes they don't adjust for a long time, but after a while they do. And so the real question is to ask, how fast do countries adjust? Why does that matter? Why does the timing matter? Well, because I told you about the self-reinforcing element in that. So the faster you adjust, the faster you resolve the problem, the lower that you are going to have, and the longer you are going to take in adjusting your fiscal policies, the bigger problem and the bigger debt stock you end up with. And so my thesis is that the most indebted countries, the problem that the most indebted countries currently have is rooted in the type of tax and spending programs that they adopted at the time when their governments first expanded. So whether it was right in the post-war period or in the 60s, the 70s, or the 80s, what matters is what type of policy, what kind of redistributive agreements did they adopt at the time. But counterintuitively, I don't say that it's the size of the spending commitments that matter. I don't even argue that it has to do with the size of entitlements or the welfare system. What really matters is how inclusive or universalistic those arrangements were. Because my argument is that those countries are least able to deal with budgetary pressures and debt accumulation that adopted very targeted, divisive, exclusionary policies. By contrast, countries who adopted inclusive policies have no problem dealing with budgetary pressures, even if their governments are really large and their entitlement commitments are really large. And I call this universalistic versus targeted nature of policies, fiscal polarization. And I will explain more in detail in a moment what I mean by fiscal polarization. But let me first explain why I think targeting or fiscal polarization matters for how countries deal with their debt problems. And let me present the polarization exposure model that explains the importance of fiscal polarization. I like to say that the polarization exposure model is the love child of Peter Gurevich and game theory, specifically Alessin and Rhodes, but I'm the foster parent of this model, and so I'm going to present it. So the polarization exposure model draws very heavily on Peter Gurevich's work, and especially on his insight about the limits to governmental power, or in other words, the necessity of having social support if you want to make big policy changes. And because Gurevich points out that groups have many ways of resisting policies that hurt them. Not only electoral power, but also the power to lobby, the power to move capital abroad, the power to go on strikes, and so on. And obviously, fiscal stabilization is going to hurt several groups in society, either through tax increases or spending cuts. But before your eyes glaze over and think that this is just an argument about how tax increases and spending cuts are unpopular, I want to point out that that's not the point I'm trying to make. The point I'm trying to make is that governments need to be able to find at least one specific stabilization package that they can push through society that has enough of a support of a large part of society, which Peter Gurevich calls a social coalition, even in the face of groups, or even in the face of resistance from groups who are hurt by that package. And so the polarization exposure model tries to explain under what conditions can you find a mix of tax increases and spending cuts that a majority of society supports. And so that's where I get to the second point, or the second element of the polarization exposure model, which is the war of attrition model, originally developed by Alessin and Rhodes in 1991. And they say that any group in society will support a given stabilization under two conditions. One is that they have a stake in having eliminated the fiscal problem. The second is that there is no other way for them to reduce the amount of fiscal pain that they suffer from a mix of tax increases and spending cuts. Why would a group have a stake in fixing the fiscal problem? Well, fiscal problems very often have economic side effects that affect the income-producing capacity of society. They cause inflation, they cause higher interest rates than in other countries, and these problems are likely to affect sales and profits and jobs in sectors of the economy that are exposed to international competition. So in an open economy, large parts of society are going to have a stake in eliminating the budgetary problems. Under what conditions? So the second part is, how can a group minimize the pain it suffers from fiscal stabilization? Well, if there was only one way to plug a budgetary hole, then whoever has a stake in fiscal stabilization would be best off going through that stabilization package as soon as possible, because the later you engage in stabilization, the more it's going to hurt, because interest rates have compounded the problem, so the bigger adjustment you have to make. However, if there is several different ways in which the pain of fiscal stabilization can be distributed across society, then you might be interested in resisting a package that is not favorable to you, in the hope that next time the government is going to try to put into place a series of or a combination of tax increases and spending cuts that actually hurts somebody else much more. And so then it becomes a waiting game, and hence the name of the war of attrition model. And so when I talk about fiscal polarization, I refer to the degree to which it's possible to hit one part of society and not hit another part of society, because the more, and it refers to the phenomenon where the payers and the beneficiaries of certain fiscal programs are very distinct, because the more those groups are distinct, the easier it is to design a stabilization package that hurts some but not the others. And so therefore there is a greater incentive for groups to try to resist packages and try to force the government to hit somebody else. And so if we put all of that together, then we find that fiscal polarization reduces the chance of having enough social support, having enough groups sign up to any one stabilization package, whereas international exposure increases that social support. However, I was also harping on the dynamic nature of this problem. I was saying that if you treat a fiscal problem and if you leave a fiscal problem untreated, then it becomes bigger with time. And that actually plays a big role in this model as well, because these two forces, the incentive to fix the problem because we need to be competitive internationally, and the incentive to resist certain fiscal stabilization packages because we want others to bear the pain, those two forces are not static. As the problem grows, as interest compounds the fiscal problem, the incentive to stabilize becomes bigger because the problems associated with the fiscal imbalances are bigger. On the other hand, so as time passes, the influence of international exposure increases. However, and this is the least intuitive part of the model, also the impact of fiscal polarization decreases, because the more time passes by, the less chance the less hope you can have that if you resist the next stabilization package, then there is going to be another one or that other parts of society are going to take an unfavorable fiscal stabilization package lying down. So the third part of the model is that with the passage of time, the relative importance of polarization and exposure changes. So let me show you the two dimensions on kind of a map. And so what this shows is that if you have an open economy and a country with low fiscal polarization, then adjustment is going to be instantaneous, because low fiscal polarization means there is no incentive for groups to resist packages, because any one package is going to hurt every group almost equally. If you have universal, all-encompassing policies, so for example, if you have a universal welfare state financed by taxes, then your decision, as we say it in Hungarian, whether you want to bite one finger or the other, right? But you will anyway be hurt. You can stabilize that welfare system by either paying more taxes or getting less benefits, but because every group is equally affected by both measures, you don't really care, right? So there is no room for conflict. And because your economy is very open, you have very high incentives for getting the problem fixed as fast as possible. So, however, if you are in this range, and I'm not sure I can, this range, so if you have moderate fiscal polarization, moderate economic exposure, then the incentives to stabilize your budget are slightly smaller, because exposure gives you less of an urge to decrease inflation, decrease interest rates. At the same time, you do have an interest, each group has an interest in resisting policies that, or interest in resisting tax cuts and tax increases and spending cuts that hit it most. But at the same time, as I said before, the importance of economic exposure increases, and therefore you will have stabilization, just not instantaneously, right? And so this would be a case of a country that waits for a long time and then suddenly chooses to undergo fiscal polarization. This range, on the other hand, So in countries which are very polarized and almost completely closed, have no incentives. In this case, groups within society have no incentives to undergo fiscal pain, and they have very high incentives to try to put the burden on polarization on others. I will show you in a second how different countries line up on this map, because I hope that's going to make it a bit clearer. But I wanted to talk to you about or explain fiscal polarization a tiny little bit more in detail, because I realize that that's the least intuitive part of this model. So what is fiscal polarization? One thing that I already mentioned is how fiscal polarization might play out in the case of welfare states or welfare arrangements. So if you have welfare arrangements that are universally available to all sections of society and they are financed by general based taxes, then that's not a polarizing welfare arrangement, because if you want to consolidate the system, you will either have to suffer from higher taxes or suffer from greater spending cuts. But if you have a welfare system in which employers pay into a bucket from which workers get benefits, that's going to be a more polarizing system, because if you wanted to consolidate that social security regime, you could either hit employers with higher social security contributions, or you could hit workers with lower, less generous entitlements. Another example of how fiscal polarization plays out is institutionalized pork barrel spending. So we usually think about pork barrel spending that is very particularistic. It always is targeted to a certain group, but we also think of it as kind of a haphazard. Whatever government is in power is going to favor certain groups or certain electoral districts that it really needs to swing. But but in certain cases, for example, in Italy, with the case of the underdeveloped South, or in Japan, where the government sustained the underdeveloped rural economies through such pork barrel spendings as investment projects or infrastructure, pork barrel spending becomes this institutionalized element of the budget that whole sections of society build their entire livelihoods on, right? And then you can't just say, oh, let's just cut infrastructure as if it was a non-polarizing element, because if you cut infrastructure, you cut the livelihood of the southerners in Italy or rural populations in Japan. Also, another element where I wanted to show how fiscal polarization works, public employment seems like an innocuous issue, but in many countries, like in Greece or again in the south of Italy, public employment is a way to sustain the livelihoods of people in depressed areas. And so in that case, it is going to be a polarizing element, because if you cut public employment, then that's going to be targeted very specifically at a certain section of society. I also wanted to show that this doesn't only work on the spending side. You can have very polarizing tax arrangements. So for example, in the Nordic countries, where you have a combination of progressive and regressive taxes, everybody kind of bears a proportionate balance in taxation. So it doesn't really matter how you change taxation is going to affect everybody similarly. Whereas if you have a very progressive tax system, then increasing taxes is going to have very different meanings for the lower ranks or the upper income levels. One last example that I wanted to give you with respect to taxation is that, for example, in many countries, tax evasion is employed by very specific groups, mostly small and medium-sized economies. So if a government tolerates tax evasion, that's going to be a very polarizing tax policy element, because cracking down on tax evasion sounds like a no-brainer, like an efficiency exercise, but in many countries it's actually a very polarizing policy move because you are targeting specifically those small and medium enterprises who are engaging in this behavior. So what I'm trying to show you by these examples is when I talk about fiscal polarization, I can't really give you an overall universalistic criteria what kind of policy elements are going to be polarizing and what they aren't, because it always depends on the actual setting and how those policies are used. So in Belgium, public employment is used just functionally to provide services and administration and so on. And so therefore there it's not a polarizing element. But in Italy or in Greece, where it's actually the bedrock of certain groups' livelihoods, then it's a very polarizing element, because if you want to cut it, then you are hurting certain people. Same thing with the pork barrel spending. So what I'm trying to show you here is that, the Supreme Court judge, when he said, I know porn when I see it, I know fiscal polarization when I see it, but I can't give you a definition of what is fiscally polarizing. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about how I selected my cases for the book. And so you recognize the fiscal polarization map that I showed you before. And so one of my main cases is Italy, which is in the moderate polarization, moderate exposure range. And the reason why, and this is the case that I'm going to tell you a little bit about today, because it's an ideal case because it really shows how a country goes from a long stalemate and a huge fiscal problem to instantaneous breakthrough and a gigantic political and policy change. And so it actually helps me show how this happens across time. What's the dynamic element of this model? But I also wanted to, before I get into the Italian case, I also wanted to show you a little bit what else I discuss in the book. So I also discuss Belgium and Ireland, which are both extremely open economies. And so I use them as so-called most similar cases because they're very similar politically. They have similar government structures, fairly similar corporate structures. I'm happy to discuss the nitty-gritty of where they are similar or not similar in those respects. But what I wanted to show is that in the politics, a lot is very similar amongst Ireland and Belgium, and I can keep the exposure dimension stable. What they differ on is the level of fiscal polarization, because Ireland has this quasi-universal welfare state. Again, there is a lot to refine there, and so I'm happy to explain why I say it's quasi-universal. But it's basically, it's very in its architecture. It's different from in its formal architecture. It's different from Denmark, but in its effects, it's basically the same type of universalistic welfare state like Denmark's, except it's much smaller. Whereas in Belgium, you have this really polarizing social security system, which is employer finance and provides very, very generous benefits to workers. And so what I show in the book is that in Ireland, governments can put into place austerity packages for the austerity package, and nobody bats an eye, and it's completely consensual. Whereas in Belgium, there are these big, huge fights with a lot of general strikes, and Belgium basically cannot adjust its social security system at all. It can cut everything else, everything that is non-polarizing in the budget, but because its main problem is the social security deficit, therefore it can never actually resolve its problems. And so this case selection is as an example of why even in very open economies you can have problems if you have higher fiscal polarization. I put Denmark in as a shadow case so that I can show that government size doesn't matter. So I find Ireland has a fairly small government, Denmark has a very big government, And Denmark is slightly less open than Ireland, but what I show is that also in Denmark there are two shocks that start Denmark on a really steep slope of debt accumulation. But just like as in Ireland, the government can cut anything, can increase any tax, can cut any benefits, and nobody resists because the level of fiscal polarization is fairly low. Japan and Greece, by contrast, are both very intensely polarized and very closed. And I use them as a most different systems design. So it's difficult to think of countries that are more different than Greece and Japan, both economically and their political setups, even the place that they have in international relations. They are just entirely different. But what I show is because of intense fiscal polarization, those two are the countries who can never change anything that has once been set down in terms of fiscal policy. Japan cannot introduce a single tax, even though it tries for years and years. It cannot cut welfare benefits. It cannot stop the flow of funds from the government to the depressed rural areas. Nothing changes. And it's the same in Greece. Whenever you try to increase taxes, cut pensions, change the subsidy system, everybody is up in arms. And in the book, I argue that Greece is a really important example because it shows how difficult it is to change anything even after the country has gone bankrupt and has been pretty much under the tutelage of the Troika. So this is the setup for my book. And Canada is literally only in the book because the reviewer said, one of the reviewers said, well, wouldn't it be interesting to know how it applies to Canada? And I thought, that would indeed be very interesting, so I put it in. But if you want to talk about it, what is really interesting, what ended up being really interesting about Canada is that in terms of openness, it's right between Italy and Belgium, and the story is kind of like right between the Belgian and Italian story. Very, very similar, very similar types of conflicts, very similar level of fiscal polarization, and very similar outcomes, actually. I'm happy to talk about it if we have time for it later. But so I wanted to talk to you a little bit about Italy because that's where that's a case where I can show how you go from groups resisting fiscal stabilization to and being conflicted about what kind of tax increases or budget cuts can be put into place, and then suddenly, as the pressure mounts from international exposure, there is this breakthrough element. And so, if you look at the chart, I'm better with my fingers than with the pointers. I'm just going to do my fingers. So what you see is that Italy starts to accumulate more and more debt from the 1970s, and nothing seems to happen for 2 decades. And then suddenly, at the beginning of the 1990s, it starts to cut back and manages to decrease its debt all the way until approximately until 2000. What you see here is that the debt stabilizes, but that's actually a setback because at this time, interest rates are still nosediving across Europe. So Italy should be, if it stayed the course, it should be decreasing its debt level precipitously. And the fact that it wasn't decreasing its debt level shows that it basically abandoned earlier fiscal stabilization policies that it adopted in the 1990s. So Italy's story is about stalemate, breakthrough, and then kind of a relapse. And the part about the relapse is not explained by the model itself, but I'm going to show you how it's an exogenous shock from euro accession. And so what we see in the 1980s is very intense polarization about the budget and the public deficit in general. Because what happens is that in the end of the 1960s and beginning of the 1970s, Italy adopts a series of policies that kind of sets the state for what's happening in the 1980s. And so you might know about the so-called hot autumn when unions got onto the streets and there was a lot of labor unrest. And basically, workers in the dynamic North wrestled a lot of concessions in the form of a huge, very generous welfare state from the government. But of course, it was enormously expensive, and the government had to do a tax reform. But then that tax reform hurt its main constituencies, large corporations and small and medium enterprises. So in order to counterbalance the effect of the tax reform on those constituencies, what the government basically did was targeted tax exemptions to large corporations, and and basically it closed its eyes to increasing tax evasion by small and medium enterprises. So what happened was spending went up because a large welfare state was created, but large corporations and small and medium-sized enterprises kind of opted out of paying taxes. And a fourth element of that the budgetary system adopted in the 1970s was more money going to the South, which was still depressed. And this is where I talked to you about the importance of public employment in that region and public projects. And the reason why the government at the time needed to step up money going to the South is because it needed the electoral support from that region. But basically, the way social coalitions lined up in the 1980s predestined the 1980s to be a period of stalemate, because those social coalitions were based around every group keeping the fiscal privileges it got in the 1960s and the 1970s. So the coalition in power throughout the 1980s, usually referred to as pentapartito because there was 5 parties. Those 5 parties were supported by large corporations, small and medium enterprises, and the dependents of the South. And in order for this government to stay in power, none of those elements that benefited these groups could be touched. But at the same time, whenever the government tried to touch the welfare system, the unions were up in arms, there were general strikes, and the government backed down. So it was a perfect stalemate. But subterraneously, under the surface of this stalemate, there was escalating pressure from the economic front, because the dynamic North was very much exposed to international competition, and because part of the deficit was monetized in this time. There was excess inflation, so there was much higher inflation than in many of Italy's trading partners like Germany or the Netherlands, and that meant that sales went down, profits went down, there was a huge wave of bankruptcies, and lots of jobs were lost. And so there were signs of increasing pressure on the political establishments. Corporations started to back out from behind the pentapartito coalition. Small and medium enterprises and their workers in the North started to flock to the Lega, which at the time wasn't called the Lega, but it was called Lega Lombarda first, and then it was then called the Lega Nord, but it's the same party that you now know as the Lega. And you also saw that the workers were increasingly upset with this state of affairs as well, because they lost a lot of support as people were unable to find jobs. And so in the 1990s, in the beginning of the 1990s, you have this major breakthrough, which is usually called the fall of the First Republic. Old parties disappear as voters completely abandon them. The unions suffer a lot of setback. And what you find is these new parties emerging and making compromises with unions as you never saw before. And so the social coalitions completely rearrange under this new political setup. And organized labor and large corporations sit down to talk. So the corporate relations, suddenly you see all of these social pacts that were impossible before. And you see this governmental formation where the center left is externally supported by the Lega in all of these fiscal stabilization packages that hurt the South a lot, but also include a lot of compromises that hurt these groups as well, right? And so you might ask me, did I just say that the fall of the First Republic was the outcome of fiscal problems? And yes, I am saying that. I know that everybody, it's all about corruption scandals and people being fed up with how things were. But to me, it is actually also the outcome of old social coalitions being untenable, right? So those social coalitions had to reform for fiscal reform to become possible, and they did. And in the course of reforming, they took down the entire party system and reformed the way unions worked. And so what we see is that these compromise measures, like corporate tax increases, a crackdown on evasion, and pension reforms, it kind of affect everybody who is in the ruling coalition. But of course, the biggest share is going to groups that are not represented in the coalition, which are the Southerners. So there is a lot of cuts. The entire infrastructure for funneling funds or channeling funds to the South is destroyed, right? And so you might ask, okay, so this is what the model explains. Why is there a relapse after the euro accession? And my argument is that it's basically the euro accession takes out of the equation that incentive to compromise because competitiveness is now insulated from budgetary problems, by which I'm not saying that it's insulated from inflation differentials, because it isn't. But inflation is not generated by the central bank monetizing the debt, right? So nobody cares about that anymore in Italy, and therefore they have no reason to sustain these compromises. So corporations don't want to stick with the corporate tax increases. SMEs don't want to stick by a policy that cracks down on evasion, and workers don't want to go into further pension reforms. So what happens is that really, after the euro, what is recreated is the same situation as we saw in the 1980s, that the coalitions reform around the defense of fiscal vested interests. And so what we know as the center-right coalition under Berlusconi is basically based on an anti-tax state dependency coalition. So funds start to go back to the north. There is numerous tax amnesties saying whatever you evaded is yours, and they start to cut corporate taxes. But unions are still strong enough to block welfare reform, and that's why we see what I showed you here. That's why we see the effect of these reforms peter out. That even though Italy should be decreasing its debt because of decreasing interest rates, it isn't, because it has gone back to its old ways from the 1980s. And so what I find really interesting is that I believe that, I don't know if you remember when things were going really badly at the end of the 2011, Angela Merkel basically forces out Berlusconi, and Monti comes in, and Monti is this caretaker prime minister who tries to institute reforms. And he tries to introduce a new coalition building strategy. He tries to define conflicts along the insider-outsider division. Basically, it says you young people should revolt against your old parents because they took the money, and it's not about these different groups. It's about the young and the old. But and Renzi goes along very much that way, but we see how successful it was. Now Renzi is out of power, and the 2018 elections, to me, completely reconfirm the importance of the state dependency tax evading coalition, because basically that's what happened. So they elected the Lega, who said, okay, we are going to cut taxes. You don't have to evade taxes anymore because we are just going to abolish them. Okay, that goes a little far, but basically it's very much centered on decreasing taxes, whereas the Movimento Cinque Stelle is all about just giving income to people who don't have a job, right? So it's very much talking to the state dependency coalition. And so just to finish up, so what's the implication of my theory? Well, one sad implication is that there is no solution to this problem as such. because I talk about social coalitions, and because, for example, how we saw in the case of Renzi and Monti, you can't just redefine social coalitions willy-nilly. It's really difficult to say what these countries could do in terms of what kind of policies they could put into place. Very importantly, I want to reinforce or emphasize that not only is there no solution, but especially what this shows is the limitation to institutional fixes that actors like the European Union try to put into place. You can't rein in these kinds of problems just via saying you can't borrow more than 3% or else. Right? So the whole, to me, the whole experiment with the Stability and Growth Pact makes no sense in light of what's happening with these countries. I also wanted to emphasize a finding that this is not about government size, right? So very often, people talk about the size of the welfare state, and people talk about the size of welfare constituencies as being the main obstacle to fiscal stabilization. As I showed in the case of Denmark, that's not the case, right? It doesn't matter how big welfare states are. The main point is how universal, how encompassing they are. And so therefore, my last point is that if you don't want to get into a lot of trouble later, you'd better design universalistic and all-encompassing fiscal policies. Thank you very much for your attention.
Questions? Who's first? Alex.
Thank you. That was fascinating, and I was especially fascinated by the argument that Berlusconi is basically a product of the EU, which, since I hate the EU, I was very delighted to hear that, and I especially hate the Eurozone. So this is a question, though, about how you were explaining how Euro accession, what it is about Euro accession that explains the breaking up of this fiscal discipline coalition. So was it an argument that it's because joining the euro changes the borrowing costs for Italy and therefore relieves some of the fiscal constraint on that? Because now the borrowing costs of Italy are not in fact determined by the size of the Italian economy but by the Eurozone, and so they're kind of under less discipline than they were before. And if that's the case, so that's sort of, if that's the case, I would like to hear sort of more explicitly how it is, because it seems the Eurozone also does one other thing, which is it changes the way in which fiscal discipline is imposed upon states, i.e. through the political mechanisms of the European Central Bank and the EU, not just by the random operations of bond vigilantes and owners of bonds. I mean, they also work. If that's the case, then it does seem to, the size of the government doesn't matter, but the size of the economy does. I mean, it seems like Italy hasn't been disciplined in the same way as, say, Greece has, because everybody knows that forcing Italy to make we just saw it recently, actually, forcing Italy to make these dramatic concessions is just going to lead to a major crisis in the Eurozone, whereas Greece was so small you could just kind of bloody the corpse and hang it up and put Greece on display, because it didn't really matter in the end if Greece left. So, two-part question. How exactly is it that Euro accession explains why this fiscal discipline changes? And is it just because of the change in borrowing costs, or the way in which fiscal discipline gets imposed on countries given the political character of the Eurozone?
So that's actually a very interesting question, because I also spend a little time in the book on arguing about why Italy wanted to be in the euro in the first place. I mean, we all know it was disastrous, just as disastrous as for Greece. There is a reason why Italy has been doing so badly. And so there is an ex ante and an ex post part to it. And I think many of the actors saw quite clearly both the risks and the benefits, and they ended up agreeing on accession in the end, exactly because they thought so before they joined, they had had a debt to GDP ratio of about 120%. So that was really when they were at the big breaking point, and what they saw is that everybody else's costs were going down. So one reason why they joined the euro in the first place was that. And there is a lot of evidence of that in the minutes of discussions and so on. But at the same time, I'm also arguing that maybe some of the actors, I mean, the problems are so big, and the issue of having monetized this debt was so open in the 1980s that maybe that, and I didn't really find as much evidence of that, but there is hints in the discussions that basically Italy really just wanted to remove that kind of a power, the power to monetize that and create excess inflation from the Italian sphere. There's a lot of talk about how the Banca d'Italia was this, this bastion of authoritarianism and low inflation policies, but basically what was happening is that they couldn't resist the pressure from the government still to monetize. And so there is a book by Fratellini and I forget the other person's name, but I could look it up in this, about how this was open knowledge that the Banca d'Italia can never sustain the pressure to monetize that, right? So the other reason is that because this link between inflation and debt was fairly clear at the time, there is a lot of evidence of that in the discussions, that they really just wanted to remove it to somebody else. I'm not sure how much they believed in the disciplining factor, because what you are talking about, how the Eurozone made an example of Greece, that's once they have gone bankrupt, right? I'm not sure that these guys would have wanted to do that in order to make an example to the government, right? So, and before bankruptcy, the EU has no leverage. And that's exactly what the SGP showed. Even now, in 2018, they said, now we are going to bring back that one element of the SGP that we did away with when Germany was supposed to be fined. They're bringing back that fine, and then what can they do? The government still says, bring it on. Let's see if you want us to go bankrupt, right? So what I'm trying to say is that you have to go bankrupt to be completely dependent for your policy making on those Europeans, and before that, it's very open still. So that constraint is not really biting. And so, but what I'm arguing is that because that link between public debt and inflation is broken, there's no reason to compromise just for the sake of keeping inflation under control.
Hi, thank you. This was really interesting. I like the entire part about Peter Gorer, which is interest groups and tying that to economic openness. But I was still wondering, while you were going through the talk, since you bring in the element of time and compounding interest, etc., what's the role of financial actors and financial markets? Because especially as the debt burden starts to increase, there is an upward pressure on interest rates, which means that the current bondholders who hold bonds, the value of their assets starts to fall, and then they can start to complain or enforce some sort of adjustment or demand some sort of an adjustment. So that's one thing. The other question that I had was, since you at the end said that there is no solution, but in the scenario, I mean, the US is not the right example to give for a variety of reasons, but in the scenario that high levels of borrowing can get channeled in a way that it smoothens consumption, or just directly through government spending, there is a boost to growth, then your debt can, in terms of the ratio, can fall. So the Raghuram Rajan's idea of let them eat credit, for example. So where does all of that fit into the story?
So it's also interesting that those are exactly the two criticisms I got in a recent book review. Where are the financial markets in all of this? So is the one. So financial markets in this period, it changes a lot, right? So things change very much after the beginning of the 1990s. Until the 1990s, Italian debt was held by grandmothers and dentists, as they say. So it's held by the population, and we were just discussing this with Mark before the talk, that many people actually say that instead of collecting taxes, closing the eye to tax evasion, instead of collecting taxes, you borrowed the money from the same people who would save and then, held it as debt. So, and that was true in Belgium. It's still true in Japan. So in different places and in different times, this matter differs a lot. So throughout this period that I'm talking about, in most of these countries, so up to the beginning of the 1990s, most of these countries are indebted to their own electorate, mostly. So most of the debt is domestically held. From the 1990s, it's a very different dynamic, and it's complicated by the Eurozone membership, of course. But that's where there is much more volatility and much more of a risk from footloose investors who can just move their investments from one place to the other. And the second question was about why these countries didn't just grow out of their debt, right?
Yeah, if you channel borrowing into some sort of conduit for growing, either through smoothing consumption or through government spending.
Yeah, so I have two things to say about that. So on the one hand, Italy was growing fairly well in this period, and so this is another thing that we were talking about. It's amazing how it could, how the debt could outpace even fairly high growth rates, especially compounded with the inflation. It was really high nominal growth rates. So growth wasn't the problem behind this. The other issue is that because most of these funds are always tied down to these specific interest groups, this is not always in ways, so the money is not spent in ways that really stimulates the economy anymore. So one reason why I think Japan cannot spend its way out of its depression is because the money is always channeled into this clientelistic spending, the same way as in Italy, in ways that doesn't do anything for the economy anymore, right? So in principle, if you want to, after the Great Depression, FDR was building dams and roads, but in Japan and in southern Italy, you can't build more bridges and roads because they are already full of roads and bridges, right? So what I'm trying to say is that most of these things are not productive and they don't really boost consumption because they are already factored into how the economy works at time zero, and so you can't really. So what I'm trying to also say that these types of conflicts, they tie the hands of governments because you can't direct funds in ways that would stimulate the economy. You have to direct funds in ways that the different interest groups who are strong enough, who have a leverage over the government demanded, if that makes sense.
Fascinating talk. I have two questions, both of which are related. So what do you think is the relationship between private debt and public debt here? And the reason I'm asking this is twofold. First, this period is a period of massive financialization in Europe as well. You see hedge funds, venture capital firms, private equity firms coming and basically stripping some of the tax base in these countries. So that puts you on one wall on one side. The other problem is in many of these heavily indebted European, Southern European countries, these are the companies where banks, I'm Turkish, I'm loving the farm story here because it belongs to my farm. The Spaniards, French, Italians, they expanded to the slightly riskier peripheral markets like Turkey, like Greece. So the private sectors ended up being heavily indebted, which required bailouts for the financial sector, but at the same time you had less of the money because your manufacturing base was being stripped away by these, German, British, American private equity firms. So there seems to be a private debt story that's happening in the parallel here. What do you think? Do you think that it comes in? Is there? What do you think is happening on that dimension of the story?
So I would argue that that's more true for the Greek story, right? So in Greece there is also a bit of private debt accompanying the public debt. In the case of Japan and Italy and most of Belgium, there is actually net savings in most of these countries, right? So I'm not sure I understand your question correctly. So In a sense, yes. Public debt and private debt are fungible in the sense, there is if there is a total global supply of credit, then either one or the other takes it up. But I'm not really sure I understand how your question about investment in riskier territories relates to this.
I think, if I do a little bit on this, that it's the prelude to the what did you call it, the 2009 bailout agreement for Eastern Europe. Essentially, the banking circuits had become overloaded. So when they were devalued, they went on the home balance sheets. So these core countries have to bail out these periphery assets. And there's nowhere to mark them, because if you mark them to market, then you make massive losses. So it ends up indirectly coming up in public debt. I think that's basically it, right?
Yeah, I mean, I would have never been able to articulate it.
That's why I'm the prof. Right. There we go.
So, yeah, I mean, there is a reason why I'm stopping in 2007, because the financial crisis and the implications of bank bailouts, it opens up a whole new story, right? So what I'm trying to do here is to look at the public debt story in and of itself. And so cases like the UK and Ireland and Spain are going to be hugely interesting, but they're not really what I'm talking about. On the one hand, I was lucky enough to say, at the time of writing, this was too close, so I can't look at it. But it's just a very different type of problem, right? So in the period that I talk about, these things are fairly isolated. There isn't a lot of interbleeding between the two spheres. But yes, after the 2000s, this becomes a really big issue of how, the Irish case, how bad bank debt becomes the Irish government's debt, which then again becomes the European debt and so on. So yeah, that fungibility is a huge factor after from the late 2000s. I'm not sure if my model talks about that part at all.
In fairness, yours is long-run debt accumulation rather than instant vulnerability
Yes.
from your private sector.
Yes.
It is a different story in that sense. Anyone else? We are now at the 1 o'clock witching hour. All right, I'll get one in closing. Can you go back to your graph that shows high vulnerability, middle vulnerability, low vulnerability, or rather the other way around? This one, right. So the one I was thinking of there was, what if you're really open and you've got intense fiscal polarization? Who should sit there?
So what is interesting is that Belgium is not very intense, but still there is a fair amount of polarization. And what happens in Belgium is that they frantically cut everything, right? Except for the one thing that is really polarized, right? So what happens in Belgium is that Belgium cuts its government spending by like 15% of the GDP. It's enormous. It's outrageously high. I mean, if you have ever been to Brussels, now you know why the roads are so terrible and why everything is so dilapidated. They went from being one of the highest spenders on public investment to the absolute lowest spenders, right? And so what happens in Belgium is this strange combination of immense austerity with absolutely no action on the polarization front. So, and I actually argue in the book that part of the Flemish Walloon conflict and everything that's breaking that country apart is that because all of those funds that should have gone to public consumption suddenly became so scarce that the two parts of the country had to fight tooth and nail for that very little amount of money that was left over. So my argument is that initially openness wins out, and that's what happened in Belgium, 1982. So Belgium puts into place the first stabilization package as fast as Ireland does. But when it realizes that that's not enough, they don't do anything else. They just sit around and wait for that to go up to 130%. That was Belgium was the most indebted country in the late 1980s, whereas Ireland said, oh, if these weren't enough, then let's cut these or let's increase those taxes, and Belgium is unable to do that, right? So I can't think of a country that is so even more polarized than Belgium, where every single aspect, I mean, Greece and Japan are, in the sense that in Greece and Japan, every single aspect of the budget, both the tax side and the spending side, is somebody's fiefdom, I'm not sure what would happen to them if they were as open as Belgium.
So if we went out of this set of countries, so we'll never use the phrase developed world anymore, but if we think, let's say, Argentina or Venezuela, right, so there you have it, super intense polarization and very, very open. And what do you get in both cases? Even when they make heroic efforts to consolidate debt, because they're so open and so susceptible to investor sentiment, you could be doing all the right things and you still get walloped, which is Argentina, or you basically become a rent generator, which is Venezuela. So you could extend this even further. In lieu of that, you could say indefinite delay, given your model, fiscal polarization, which is a proxy for political polarization, and economic exposure. The United States is the most closed economy in the world and sits right in that corner. So I
Yes,
think you
it
can
does.
actually extend it even further.
I agree completely on the U.S. point, as well as on the Argentina and Venezuela point. That's where kind of my expertise ends. So I know about the U.S., about Argentina and Venezuela, and I only know as much as any economist reader would. But yes, I would definitely put them into that corner.
All right, well, thank you for coming to the final session of the Rhodes Institute Kebab and Curry Seminar. Thank you very much. See you in the new year.
Much.